I am exhausted, but how are you?
Yeah, I don't think I've. Anytime I get on Facebook, I see you talking to somebody else, and then of course I scroll down and see that you've already spoken about 5 or 6 other people before. So
Yeah.
you're very busy these
Yeah.
days. Um, but it's good work. It's great work. It's important work, and I congratulate you for it. And we are the better for the interviews that you are conducting. We're learning a lot about a variety of people with very important trajectories themselves, and so it's much to be appreciated. Okay, well, so today we talk about chapter 2, Matt, and we'll talk about money as it is addressed in this particular book, Capital, Volume 1. We'll talk about money, and then we will address some of its general implications, and then begin to hone down on the concept of money, particularly as far as Chicana and Chicano people are concerned. And to get the show started, Matt. Oh, and then of course, we welcome questions and comments and such. And by all means, please, let us know you're there. Let us know you're there. We're eager to engage you in discussion, and then we'll reserve the last portion of our discussion, Matt,
Yeah.
for such things. And it would be very interesting if you could help us to close our discussion today with some poetry. Is that possible?
Yeah, I'll figure it out as the conversation goes.
All right, perfect. All right. Well, what I'd like to do, Matt, is I'd like to begin with a quote to set the stage. One of the things that I've learned as I have read biographies about Marx is that I've learned that, of course, in addition to being chased all around Europe and suffering terrible tragedies on account of, having to exile and then, of course, family trauma and such, one of the things that I learned about him was that he was an avid reader of Shakespeare. And so as I was reading chapter 2, it occurred to me to draw on what I think is a literary point of reference that will help us to understand a subsequent quote in chapter 2 that I'd like to address, and then we can get into the business of the very language in the book. Okay. And this is, of course, a quote, a Shakespearean quote that many of us are familiar with, and it goes the following way. It says, "All the world is a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and act one man in his time, and one man in his time plays many parts. His acts being 7 stages, at first the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, and then whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face, creeping like snail unwillingly to school, and then the lover, sighing like furnace with woeful ballad made to his mistress' eyebrow. Then a soldier full of strange oaths, and bearded like the pard, jealous in honor, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the bubble reputation, even in the cannon's mouth. And then the justice, in fair round valley with good cap on lined, with eyes severe and beard of formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances, and so he plays his part. The 6th age shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon with spectacles on nose and pouch on side. His youthful hose well saved the world too wide for his shrunk shank, and his big manly voice turning again toward childish treble pipes. And whistles in his sound, last scene of all, that ends this strange eventful history, is second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. Welcome, Josie. Welcome. Anyway, so that's the Shakespearean context, Matt. And now, to get us to begin to see this stage, this map, this moment, I read the following. It says here, instinctively, he's talking about people who interact with one another on the economic stage. Instinctively, they conform to the laws imposed by the nature of commodities. They cannot bring their commodities into relations as values, and therefore as commodities, except by comparing them with some other commodity as the universal equivalent. That we saw from the analysis of a commodity. But a particular commodity cannot become the universal equivalent except by a social act. The social action, therefore, of all other commodities sets apart the particular commodity in which they all represent their values. Thereby, the bodily form of this commodity becomes the form of the socially recognized universal equivalent. To be the universal equivalent becomes, by this social process, the specific function of the commodity, thus expelled by the rest. Thus it becomes money. What would you like to do, Matt? Would you like to talk about the comparison or the correspondence, or would you like to get into some other stuff having to do with this very chapter, of course?
Well, I think it's really interesting when you look at the Shakespeare quote, from "As You Like It," right? Which is actually, funny enough, it's actually a comedy. It's really interesting, how much, I mean, that little the monologue or soliloquy or whatever, it became so much more famous than the actual play.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting for the world of stage. It really kind of like professionalizes life, right? So now we're all actors, right? And within that, it gives us this kind of each one of these stations that he's describing is an economic one. It's a child being prepared to be a worker, then it becomes the worker, and the worker is full of strange oaths. So the worker believes that what they're doing is the right thing, and then by the time they're about to die, they've been ejected from this thing, and they reflect upon this thing they did. And it's really interesting how we like define ourselves. We define ourselves through these things that as Marx describes, we are kind of forced into and independent of our will. So it's the Shakespeare monologue is really interesting about how we are forcing things against our will, and more often than not forced against our independent of our will, but also independent of our consciousness, right? So we're not really aware of the fact that we are defining our entire lives by this thing that we've been coerced into. The coercion is so complete that we don't even consider it coercion. So I think that's a really that's a really interesting way to get us started today.
Yeah. I mean, it's really it's interesting to say the least. So we've been joined also by George Garcia. Welcome, George. It's good to see that you're with us as well. So one of the things that for me is really interesting is that what is happening in this particular chapter, and then, of course, we'll get into this stuff, but what is happening in this particular chapter is that not only is there a corresponding relationship articulated, at least by way of metaphor, not only is there a corresponding relationship articulated by way of this particular metaphor, whereby our interactions with one another are seen as a part of a historical script, right?
Mhm.
But the script itself is fit within not just the historical moment, but actually conversely, right? We are fit in relation to the script. In fact, the script exists in history, but the script also exists within us. And so to think about it, these historical scripts, determined as the script is by these economic relationships, whereby we encounter one another on the basis of the commodities that we possess, the commodities that we bring to our particular encounter, and then, of course, the exchanges that we make with one another on the basis of the use values contained in our commodities. Of all things that I have on my desk this morning, of all things that I have on my desk this morning is a tape measure, right? I was doing some work. Yesterday, and I brought this to my desk. But anyway, that this particular commodity, right, that containing a quantity of value, is understood for me as a particular use value, but I also understand that it is a use value for you or for some other people, and so that we interact with one another on the basis of, how much more value can I obtain from this particular commodity in relation to the commodities that you happen to possess, right? And so we engage on the basis of these particular scripts, right, that we've inherited from history. And so these scripts themselves and contain a grammar, if you will, and the grammar of these particular scripts are external to us, but then that grammar is the basis of our interaction. So anyway, and I was thinking about this, of course, because we need to interact with one another, not just on the basis of the commodities that we possess, but to the extent that money, right, the price of a particular commodity that it possesses, and the money that it could help me to obtain, implies that there is between you and I, Matt, in this particular case, implies that there is a third entity that is inserting itself in our interaction, and that insertion, or that presence, that kind of colonization, if you will, right, is mediated by way of the money commodity, fetishized as it is, inattentive as we are to its components.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I find so fascinating about chapter 2 is that the previous chapters we read, when we read the end of the book, it really said kind of like this is what happened. Kind of, it was very it's very historic, very like group people A did such and such a group of people B, and then this happened as a story, right? It's a story and it's historic. So that was kind of what set the conditions for the rest of the conversation. And then chapter 1, we went through what actually is, right? So like what like this cup is imbued with labor, right? And the human being walks around telling everyone, I have what Marx referred to as labor power, but in more common English would be the ability to labor, right? So I have the ability to make this cup. Do you want to buy my ability? Do you want to buy my ability? Do you want to buy my ability? Don't let me starve. Do you want to buy my ability? And then you get a wage, and the wage is less than it. And so we described everything that happened. What this is describing is the fact that this is what it looks like once it's set in motion. So, like, the fact of the matter is, this cup will only be produced if it for the purposes of commodity. So this is like, we've read so much of like what the intro into this process was. Like, there was a time, it was almost like we're introduced with a prelude, a time before the commodity. Now we're into the era of the commodity, and within the commodity, it's not simply enough to say this thing is produced a commodity. Where it's the fact that our commodity lifestyle gets reproduced and reproduced and reproduced every day, every second, every minute on the hour, right? Much like the ticker thing at Wall Street. It keeps creating the cycle, keeps revolving, it keeps happening over and over and over again. It's not simple. It's not static. It's not a simple way of being. It's a dynamic set of interactions that make the world the way it is, and it actually ends up working as the way in which we interact. Again, independent of our will, independent of whatever. Like, there's plenty of use value to your tape measure, but if I just hey, I could really use this, and I just take it, it's going to cause a conflict between us, right? Because you understand that, I mean, if I'm like, hey man, like, I really, really like love your house, and I could really use it, right? Your response is not simply to be like, well, I need this house, right? Your response will in turn be like, I worked for this house. I worked for this, right? But in reality, what you're saying, you're missing a couple steps. I worked, I received wages, and they were enough to buy this house. You should go work, receive wages, and buy your own house. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
So it mitigates these things, but we say it in a very kind of shorthand, like, I worked for this house. I worked for this tape measure. I worked for this. It is mine because I worked for it. And that's kind of like the way in which we think and the way in which we interact with each other. And what's being described in this chapter is how we interact with each other as individuals, as whether it's between you and I, peer to peer, or whether it's between you and your employers, or me and my employers. It describes kind of how those interactions are if our interactions are electricity, money is the wire.
Yeah. What's happening then, what's happening by way of this particular chapter, at least for me, is an analysis of human interaction and culture, really, cultural interactions that are taking place, that are very distinct from those that preceded them. One of the things that I read, of course, is in this particular chapter, is that as Marx says, a bourgeois society and bourgeois capitalism, right, distinguishes itself from a previous historical moments, in the sense that where in previous historical moments, as he writes, man commoditized man, right? In the 19th century capitalist moment, right, man then begins to commoditize land, right? And so this distinction is very important, because by way of this commoditization, a new set of rules, a new logic, a new rationality is imposed upon our relationships with one another, and so capitalism and the capitalist elite have the capacity to set the parameters, to set the stage, as it were, of our interaction. And there's plenty of stuff then here for us to draw a set of implications up. What do you think?
I think definitely. When we talk about the commodification of land, we talk about how land itself becomes this thing that in a previous period was just kind of like generally understood to be owned by the lords or by, and again, that is not that's kind of a particularly English phenomenon. I mean, it's not particular to England, but it comes, our concepts of like lords and this and that and feudalism typically emerge from England. Which is not to say that there weren't also essentially agricultural societies ruled by monarchs all throughout the world, right? So there was that sort of thing all throughout the world, but they happen differently in different places, and over because of different sets of technological capacities, different sets of, and when I say technological capacities, I don't mean one was superior, one was inferior. I mean they were just different, right? So the different ways in which, let's say, water was transferred in like say Incan society versus the way they were distributed and traveled in Persian society are going to have an effect on the entire way in which people do things, right? So our entire concept of like pre-capital, as comes to us through Marx, as comes to us through so many European Marxists, is based on England, Germany, France. It's based upon their set of concepts, right? But there are some aspects that we can look at that are similar in these kind of agricultural societies wherein property reigns, but there isn't necessarily some kind of distinct thing we would really notice as like industrial type production. So I think that the changing nature of how land is owned is extremely important, because in the past it was really kind of it's kind of like landed aristocracy, right? I don't think we would consider Ted Turner, a landed aristocrat. We wouldn't think of like Sir Baron Ted Turner or something like that. And the capital diversifies, and land just becomes no different than a pen factory or the selling of an internet service or something like that, streaming services. So that's quite different.
One of the things that since you addressed the diversification of capitalism just a few moments ago, one of the things that I think about as far as reading is that the money commodity becomes the tool par excellence, right? Becomes the tool with which interactions and exchanges take place. Increasingly becomes a tool to the extent that society is diversified, right? As history is moving forward, so to say, and as interactions and exchanges are increasingly variegated and diversified and expanded, it becomes impossible for folks to carry their use values around and expect to, exchange these use values for other use values. The kind of thinking that we might consider today, as far as swap meets are concerned, if anybody's gone to a swap meet lately, you don't go and you don't swap your things at a swap meet anymore. You use money in swap meets nowadays.
Right.
But having said that, one of the interesting things is that Marx says there's this history. I'm going to suppose that this history takes place, that the history and the development of money takes place in this particular way. But as I read it, at least the way I interpret what I read in this particular chapter, he says that more important to understand the historical rise of money is to understand its, well, I don't know if these are quite his terms, right? But to understand the presence of money in history, in the actual moment. And so what he does is he maps then, of course, money in this case. So I think there's an opportunity now to begin to talk about this particular chapter in relation to the Chicana and Chicano community, particularly as far as land is concerned. And San has offered plenty for us to think about, and so we'll get to what San has just written in just a bit. But before we do, if the commoditization of land changes our relationships with one another, on account of its commoditization within a historical moment and its commoditization within a capitalist economy. And if our relationships with one another, of course, are tied to this historical development, what of the relationships in which, or rather the context in which we find ourselves, how might we understand these interactions of these relationships, given that number one, of course, commodities are no longer produced the ways, to the extent that they were produced in, say, the LA metropolitan region, and to the extent that money as a commodity, I'm sorry, that land as a commodity itself is integrated in a new economy, as it were, where instead of the production of automobiles and tires and airplanes and such, right, land is land and land as property is commoditized, and Chicanos are excluded from those, to a large extent, are excluded from those economic interactions. How do we make sense of ourselves? How do we make sense of our interactions within this particular context?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess to make it practical, how do we make sense of ourselves in the era of gentrification? How do we make sense of our interactions? What do you think?
Well, I think that we have to be really clear about things, and this is where we get more concrete. What is land? The first question is, what is land, right? Land is that which is not the sea, right? And we don't live on the sea for the most part. Most people don't live on the sea, right? Mostly human beings live on the land, right? And this is kind of where our interactions with other human beings, for the most part, when we're not in the sky or the sea, which is the wide majority of most of our lives, to not be in the sky or the sea, but rather on the land. So the land is where we are, and that's kind of that's the use value. And it's not even use value. That's what we are born into, right? So that's the practical reality of the world. We are born on the earth. It's almost kind of this weird kind of distinction. People, I mean, a lot of people have been making this real. It's really interesting. It's coming out of a lot of memes and stuff like this. This kind of idea that it's not coming out of memes, but it's being popularized right now by memes.
Yeah.
The idea that nature is an industrial era myth, like that we are always in nature. We are never not in nature. Even if you're in New York City, where you look around, it looks like you're in a prison because you can't see nature, and you can't see trees or mountains or anything anywhere. You are still in nature. You're still in the world. You're still in the world, right? You're still a part of the natural world, and it's only the fact that you're being sold that all interaction is commercial, and you're being coerced into commercializing all your interactions, that you think that this isn't nature. Oh my God, look at that beautiful park. I'm in a park now. Now I'm in nature. My God, in LA it's a little different because you see trees and mountains all the time, right? But so it's kind of an interesting concept. First, we got to establish what is land. I mean, land is the land. That's what it physically is. It's a physical place where we live. Now, when we build up a community, we build up culture, we build up this, all of a sudden now this land is no longer just the place where we are. This land is what we name it. This land is what we inhabitants here say it is. And there's all these myths that we have about the particular things that, that mean something. So, for instance, in Los Angeles, we have the LA River, but that's not a real kind of river. It's not a raging river the way other places are, right? So in other places, you'll hear like in other parts of the country, people write songs about rivers, and there's a deep meaning they're attaching to this river, right? And this river means something. Now I can hear that and understand and interpret it, but it doesn't mean the thing to me. That if you wrote a song about a mountain, well, now I know what you're talking about. My life is like that mountain, right? So the physical landscape actually it pierces itself into our mind and creates the basis for our culture, the way we think of ourselves. So we as Chicanos are a group of people who are part of this historical thing that happened when Spain invaded the Western Hemisphere, claimed a certain land. That land gets carved out. It's now New Spain. There's a battle for independence fought by people who are, the victims of this experience, who carry to varying degrees, whose ancestry to varying degrees reflects the people who were here before the Spaniards conquered them. And that is kind of the basis for who we become. After that, you have the Anglo settlement. After that, you have the Anglo settlement coming into, what is now referred to as New England. Right now, it's called New England and not what it was before, because the English settlers ended up calling it New England, and then that sets the basis for certain things. They enslave Africans, and they now become African American, because this is the context for there. And then there's a conflict, there's a war, and they waged war against Mexico. And I think that it's erroneous to say that it was only the slave driving South that wanted more land for slavery. That's true, but it's also true that many of the major abolitionists were also in favor of stealing this land from Mexico for their own purposes, right? So like, Abraham Lincoln becomes this big figure, but Abraham Lincoln's very much a railway president, and the railway, they were very much also interested in getting a hold of that land.
Yeah,
right? So you have figures like here in California. I can't remember his name right now, but he wrote I'm blanking right now. He wrote something 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation that was supposed to be, John Fremont. 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, talking about the need to abolish slavery, right? And so that makes him this great abolitionist, but not really. Yes, but also he was a murderous person as it comes to like people, of Mexican descent here in the United States, and the newly minted Chicano people, right? He's a murderer to us, because he is invested in getting this land for this new thing. So the free soilers, as well as the slave drivers, were both invested in getting Mexican land. Why? Because that's a place they could do business. Whether their business was to take enslaved people, force them to pick cotton, or their business was to push railroads and get people to work in factories, they needed a place to do that, right? And so the people that were there before that, who had a different concept of what to do with the land, had a different concept of who should own it, being them, or should be able to live on it, being them, or should be able to do whatever they were doing on it, being them, had to be driven out. So the indigenous people of the Americas, whether they be, what today would be, I don't know, referred to like Plains Indians, like Lakota, wherever, they had to be pushed out by the Homestead Act, and people like from our community we ended up getting lynched at massive rates that are actually somewhat between the 1840s and the 1880s are actually unparalleled in U.S. history. The per capita lynching of Mexican people is actually unrivaled. It's something like I think it's something like 500 per 100,000, something like that. It's actually much larger than any other group. And we're talking about what we're talking about here is like the mass, the vigilante, the killing by vigilantes, and so much of that had to do with land seizure, right? And so you have this thing that happens to us, this very specific thing this thing that happens to our community, and it's really, really well described. Marx doesn't describe that, but Marx really describes this concept of the primitive accumulation that happens at the dawn of capital. Well, to us, we experienced that phenomenon very, very almost word for word. 1 minute we're doing this thing where we're like kind of we're like itinerant farmers, we're like working the land, we're doing this, we're doing that, mostly small, and next thing you know, we are being thrown off the land, and all of a sudden we're being thrown into this proletarian position. But we're not just proletarian, we're like hyper proletarian, and our entire existence on the land, in the land that was at one point in time that comes out of the independent struggle of this place called Mexico. What ends up happening is we end up being in that land hyper proletarialized. We become and our position within those lands questioned and controlled, and we find ourselves at the bottom of the labor pyramid. We find ourselves as the lowest paid group of people. We find ourselves with the most tenuous position, but we also find ourselves constantly being pushed out, being pulled in, being pushed out, being pulled in, being pushed out, and our right to stand on a piece of land constantly questioned. Like, I was born here. My father's side goes back to New Mexico since like the dawn of humanity, right? There's Spanish ancestry. That's where the Sedillo name comes. But the other parts of it are my ancestry from my father's side. They exist in New Mexico since people lived in New Mexico. But on the other side, but I myself, when I was a young boy, if someone wanted to insult me, coming from any different, not just white people, anyone coming from any different ethnic background, they would call me a wetback.
Yeah.
My nationality, my technical nationality, my ID, my passport, all those things, those don't matter. What mattered is that you are this thing called a Mexican, and Mexicans don't belong here. You're a wetback. Take that. Right. So like, that was a way of insulting me. That was a way of heaping something on me, and it's not just me as an individual. That's what's heaped upon all of us, regardless if you're born in Alhambra or born in Monterey.
Yeah. So land becomes the land as a commodity becomes and one's possession of it becomes a basis for our interpretation of one another, and so that we arrive on the world stage, as it were, right? And we are gauged, and we gauge one another on the basis of the rules around land and who possesses it. And certainly, one of the things that you were talking about makes me think about, and what it is you were talking about, of course, was how the Mexican experience, the Chicano experience, particularly that experience in the 19th century, is understood so well in relation to the language around primitive accumulation that Marx addresses, and that we read at the outset of our discussion. And of course, this is possible, or rather that this might be understood in this particular way, because Mexican society and Chicano society, Chicano society, had just had just sprung, if you will, from a colonial existence that was still largely determined by aristocratic precepts and aristocratic economies, linked, of course, to the Spanish Empire, and culminating, as far as the Spanish Empire is concerned, right, with its demise in the late 19th century. So the kind of attentions that you give to the on the ground experiences of Chicano people are really significant and important in this way, and can be understood historically in this particular way, so that we as a people are seen as inferior, because in this new economic context, we don't have land anymore in the middle of the 19th century in what comes to be known as the United States, and we are gauged and approached and discriminated, oppressed, hung, on the basis of these new rules. Something happens in the late 20th century and early 21st century, right, whereby the the acquisition of land that we were able to acquire and the possession of this particular commodity that we were able to acquire in the 1960s and 1970s is taken from us, right? And here, of course, in order is a discussion of and maybe in our next discussion, I ought to bring in some statistics about the quantity of land that Chicanas and Chicano people possessed leading up to 1980s, between say 1950 and 1980, and then of course since then the quantity of land that Chicanos possess in the current moment. But in any case, be that as it may, for the moment, we live in a moment where our capacity to possess land is once again undermined, and it's within that context that we might understand the kind of caging and recrimination and discrimination and oppression that is taking place today. I wonder how we can understand then, late 19th century Chicana and Chicano experience, early 20th century Chicana and Chicano experience in relation to late 20th century and early 21st century Chicana and Chicano experience as far as land is.
Well, I mean, I think whether we're talking about like the redlining of Los Angeles, as I mean, these things don't happen in a bubble. It's not like the redlining on the moon or gentrification on the moon. These things happen in physical spaces with a certain amount of population, right? So when we look at the redlining of Los Angeles, what we're also looking at is the population explosion of Los Angeles. Like in the in 1900, the population of Cleveland was larger than that of Los Angeles. That's an impossible concept to us living today, right? Yeah. That Cleveland and Cincinnati were both more populated than LA, right? That's what are you talking about, right? Sort of thing. Yeah. It's not until like I don't think Los Angeles passes up Chicago in terms of population until 1970 something, right? So like these kind of ideas that we have about LA is this booming metropolis, and so it is now, and so it has always been. It's not actually true. I mean, the major population explosions of LA happened in the 30s, the 40s, and by the 50s, then it's very clear that LA is going to be an enormous city, and then it starts to pass up Philadelphia and Chicago, etc. Right? So that's kind of what happened, right? But as that happened, as these populations were growing, people needed a place to live. They live on land. They don't live in the sea. They don't live in the sky. They don't live in beams of energy. They live on the land, and so the land was set up in a way so that black people would live here, the Mexicans would live here, the Asians would live here, white people will live here, and so these people everyone was separated, right? Now they were segregated, but they were segregated. It's not just simply they were segregated. It's not simply that, because we think of segregation of itself as just evil, right? As it's pure evil. But what makes segregation so evil is not necessarily just that people are separate and apart from one another. It's that they're separate and apart. I mean, consider a little Italy, right? A little Italy is fun. It helps people make businesses. It helps people create a tourist destination, and it's something that people can do with it. It's something, right? Now, little Italy is not nefarious because the Italians are not being oppressed in Little Italy, right? So if you go to like San Francisco and go to what's called North Beach, North Beach is really in Little Italy. I mean, what made it North Beach was like this arts destination was the fact that like there were these great poets and writers and etc. And they made it into this other thing. But if you go there, it's a Little Italy. There's a Columbus statue. It's bad for other reasons, but there's that. There's all these Italian restaurants. There's this. There's that. The other. Lawrence Ferlinghetti himself, who really kind of redefined the area as North Beach, right, is an Italian American. I mean, like the fact that it's probably there's a reason why he was able to get the loans to build a place right there in the middle of North Beach was Little Italy, and the reason why Little Italy is okay is because they're not being oppressed, right? So it's fine. So it's not like, oh my God, the Italians are being segregated or something. It doesn't function that way, right? Yet when you see, and at some point American history did, but it doesn't today and hasn't for a long time. You see in like in Chinatown. Chinatown today is still the poorest, one of the poorest sections of Los Angeles, and we see like in the film, forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown. Well, what does it mean, forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown? It means the laws don't happen here. Why don't laws happen here? Well, because they're Chinese and we're exploiting them, and because they were exploiting them, this is a zone where people can be killed, including rich white people, right? Because it happened here in Chinatown. What happens in Chinatown is going to stay in Chinatown, right? So that's the kind of concept they have there. We have a very, very similar concept of black and brown communities in the city of LA, right? That much more prevalent than Chinatown, right? This idea that like in South Central, that's a place where you can get shot and no one will care because it happened in South Central. Don't go to that South Central. You'll die there, and if you die there, your death will mean less because you died in South Central. Don't go to East LA. You're gonna die there. And if you go to East LA and you die there, you got what you had coming. You shouldn't have been in East LA. What were you thinking? It's East LA. Forget it, right? So the reason East LA is seen that way is because of the population of East LA, the population of South Central, right? And so that's what happened. I mean, that we got put into these communities, and these communities are demonized because we're there, right? They're seen a certain way because we're there. These communities get less resources. If you look at Southeast LA, it gets poisoned. If you look at like much of the communities around, they get poisoned. Cancer alleys, we live in wherever, and that is just what that is what that redlining, that segregation was all about. It wasn't just about, hey, that's Little Mexico over there, and they got really great stuff. It's not like that's Olvera Street over there, and look how wonderful it is. What a celebration of culture! I love it. Not that. I mean, not that. What it is that's East LA over there. We're not going to build the pipes. We're not going to do this. We're not going to do that. The police are going to like come through, beat everyone up, and set the conditions to where they'll beat each other up, and that's what we're going to do, right? So that's what happened to us under those conditions. Now, under gentrification, what's happening is people are moving into these neighborhoods because of the property and it's as expensive as it is. It's cheaper than living in the same neighborhoods as their parents, right? So it's as expensive as it's becoming to live in a place like Boyle Heights or El Sereno, or as these rents skyrocket. It's still cheaper than Santa Monica. It's still cheaper than Beverly Hills. It's still cheaper than these communities, right? So so people are coming in, and it's closer to the city. They're finding ways to sell property that are enticing, and again, these people have to go. Now, what's an interesting thing is, well, how do you clear the land? How do you clear the land, right? So you have this idea that, like these areas where the Chicanos live have to be cleared. So you end up with gang injunctions. You end up with, and there was a ridiculous gang injunction in Orange where there was, and I think they actually believe they defeated it, Chicanos Unidos out there, kind of really under leadership of, at least that part under Carolyn Torres and Gabby Hernandez. They fought this gang injunction where it was illegal for people to gather in front of a mural because that mural was supposedly, promoting, gang culture. So that was something that happened, I don't know, about 10 years ago, right? So that, I mean, like, this is the type of thing that they're doing. Like we see all kinds of gang injunctions. You see the fact that they're whitewashing murals. I mean, even if they're not going to be like, okay, we're going to criminalize that mural, we're just going to wipe over it, right? Because we want to bring in new people. We want to bring in new people, and we can't have the history of the people we're displacing painted all over the walls, right? We can't have this place looking like that. We can't have reminders of that, because that's not going to help us sell property. People are not going to be able to come in here, know what they're doing, and have a constant reminder by seeing like a mural of a family from the 70s happy at like a quinceañera or something like that. I'm thinking of the Payless, the Payless, one on Payless over in Boyle Heights. We can't see that every day, and walk over to Weird Waves Coffee or something like that, and feel good about ourselves. So those murals got to come down. That's really interesting, the concept of Boyle Heights. When they were gentrifying Boyle Heights, they're talking about, well, we're doing something good here. We're bringing art spaces, and this place has no art. And yet you have self-help graphics there that have been doing art for forever. Right now, that's controversial because people don't like them because they say they're part of it. Whatever. I'm not weighing in on that. but here's the other thing: is that like independent of self-help graphics, you have murals on every single wall practically in Boyle Heights. There's probably more murals per capita than anywhere. And you're saying this is an artless city. I mean, Santa Monica, compared to the white part of Santa Monica, anyway, compared to Boyle Heights is relatively artless. Beverly Hills compared to Boyle Heights is relatively artless. Beverly Hills compared to East LA or El Sereno or is relatively artless. There's no murals anywhere. There's no art anywhere. There's no public art anywhere.
Yeah.
So, so what I'm saying is that they have to remove the cultural signifiers, the cultural, and even that's like too complicated a way of saying it. They have to remove the culture. They have to remove the culture of the people that live there so that they can later remove the people.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what happened. I remember when I was, reading up on the invasion in Iraq. One of the first places, or among the first places that were destroyed, bombed by the U.S., were museums and libraries. But of course, this is a pattern that goes back in history. Those of us, of course, who know Chicano history, Mexican history, know, of course, that it is part and parcel of the process of conquest and then expropriation of land, right? And then, of course, the possession of land. You got to get rid of all the things that represent the people, and all the connections that people have to land. And so, having said that, I'm thinking then that the way that the discussion has taken place over the last 10 minutes or so is that where at the outset, at least as far as referencing the work here in chapter 2, we come to understand that land is what defines people. Land is what defines the relationships that people have with one another, right? Land is not just the actual stage upon which people interact with one another, but land is also the metaphorical basis, right, for our interactions with one another. In that sense, defined as these things are discussed and addressed as these things are in this particular chapter, the discussion that we've had now over the last 10 minutes or so is that people define land, right? And so people paint murals, people construct museums, people construct libraries, right? People then are the ones that inscribe themselves on land. And it explains, of course, then the subsequent thing, right, which is to erase any representation of people from land in order to appropriate land. So there's this, it's kind of a tug of war, that's taking place. And this tug of war that's taking place around land and between people, upon land and between people, is what is addressed in this particular book. I don't know if we've talked about it much so far. I can't remember at the moment, but certainly it is an instance of the dialectical relationships that are taking place across history, right? So that as this tug of war is taking place, as people are fighting one another or in tension with one another on top of land, and as people are removed from land, as it were, in fact, are removed from land, right? History is evolving. History is taking place. And we are on the march, according to Marx in this particular book, and in some of his other work, right? We are on the march, on a historical march to some resolution to these crises and to these tensions. There's I wish I could get to some of this stuff that has just been written.
Why don't we get to some of these questions? We have I think we have earlier comments from Josie, and then we have some statements from Zahn. But let's try and stick with questions if we can.
Yeah.
So Josie says, I meant okay. So she's like Shakespeare slant. She likes Shakespeare slant. What comes to me is Lady Macbeth. Out them spots, re-COVID, but there's so much more. Just thinking about the presence slash absence of women, pretty Eurocentric, you know. Yeah, I mean, we're reading Marx since he's a guy and he's from Europe, so I mean, it's
Well, if Marx is patriarchal, and I'm not saying that he's not, if Marx is patriarchal and Eurocentric conceptualization of history is useful to understand, the antagonisms and the historical development and the commoditization of land, then the converse discussion, the one that we were having over the last part of our discussion, starting about 15, 20 minutes ago, Matt, where it is that people define land, right? The converse of that. Well, there's opportunity there to talk about the kind of observations that Josie is making. Certainly, there's opportunity to talk about the kind of things that Josie is addressing, even preceding Marx's analysis, patriarchal as it is, etc. I'm led to think in this particular moment, some time ago I read about Christopher Columbus's log. Mm-hmm. As he was approaching what we now call America. Mm-hmm. And he identifies America as women's breasts, right? And that it's landing upon America, and then extracting the fruit of America, extracting the milk. I mean, so Marx, I'm sorry, so Columbus in the 1400s is using all these references, not just to the colonization of land, but the colonization of women, the conquest of women, so that it is part and parcel. So Josie's observations, of course, we're at the tail end of our discussion here, are taken very well. But as you say, Matt, of course, we're summarizing this work and we're thinking about the pertinence of its historical materialism, couched as it is in a history of the economy and technological developments.
Right.
It's not to say that it's not. It's not to say that it's unproblematic, because it certainly is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, of course. But I mean, I think I think anyone like writing as much as Karl Marx wrote is going to say something that's wrong.
Yeah.
Or, I say wrong things all the time. I mean, I don't write like 1/10 as much as this guy wrote, or 1/100th as much as he did. So I mean, like, but yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel I can. It's definitely very male, and it's definitely, very Eurocentric. I mean, I feel the Eurocentrism, but like, it's just a question of the totalitizing kind of like, this is the way it was kind of thing, or this is the way it is, and they're rooting it in specific things in Europe. But there's a lot of just if then proposals, if then, and we live in a world that has been shaped by the European conquest of the world, right? So that's the world we live in. It's been shaped that way. So he describes, when a factory comes in, this is going to happen. So we as Chicanos, we go in that factory, the same thing's going to happen to us. I mean, it's going to happen to us at a different level, in a different kind of, at a different. The same thing's going to happen to us. That's going to happen to we're going to get exploited at a different rate of whatever. But like, if we go into the factory and our hand gets chopped off, and we live in this near here, and we're living in that world. We're living in a world of cars, of houses, and of where we're living in this industrial world. And he really well described the industrial world. There is a second interpretation that needs to be made, and that needs to be made by us to make it make sense to us. But yeah, I'm not opposed to this idea that, like, we can take what he said and we don't have to use his terminology. We can take what he said and we don't have to use his examples. But I'm not interested in discarding a huge body of work that kind of explains how industrial society functions. 'Cause I live in an industrial society, so this guy, or post-industrial kind of now, but I live in a world that was shaped by the things he's talking about. So I'm very open and receptive to all these observations and all these calculations he came up with.
Yeah.
Even when I disagree with them, even when I disagree with someone.
Yeah. Well, Matt, we're at the close.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about land. You know, we've engaged in observations made by some of the folks that have posted. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, George. Thank you, Josie. Thank you, San. Thank you, San, very much. I read your stuff. You know, after we close, I learn from it. I appreciate it. I hope that other people are doing so as well. Dust James, thank you for your contribution as well. So we talked about land. We've talked about the push and pull. Land defining people, land defining the relationships between and among people, and then of course vice versa. People defining land, and then people inscribing themselves on land, and so on. And we've had this discussion in relation to the commoditization of our relationships and interactions upon the world stage, taking it back to the Shakespearean quote at the outset. And so we began with some literary attentions, Matt.
Right.
And literary and metaphorical attentions. And hopefully we can close with some as well, and yours in particular.
Yeah, let me see if I can find this pull this up. Oh, the world of the cage. Because you know what, I was going to end in this poem by gentrification, but I actually am working on something that let's see. This is the first part of an incomplete poem, but here we go. It's called the idea behind the poem. Huh?
Hold on a second. Is this a what is it when something is introduced for the first time by way of the media? I forget the words are escaping me.
A world premiere. This is something of a world premiere.
Is this a world premiere?
Something like that, right? Something like that. The conversation's been about land and this and that. I actually have a poem about gentrification that would go really well with this, but since you brought up that Shakespeare thing, I'm sure we'll talk about gentrification again. I'll end with the gentrification poem then. But since you brought up Shakespeare and that thing, I'm gonna do this one. All right. There is no democracy in the way of things. There is no democracy in the way of things. There is no democracy in the way of things. And torture to the hands, moved by the engine of a clock, the world as it is, whether you like it or not. For all the world's a cage, and all we men and women merely prisoners. And one man in his time can do many bids. And in this time begins with birth certificate documents, the measurement of infants, a doctor's swift hand, first in a sad, tragic line of public and humiliating pains in the ass, each preceding the next. Welcome to the world, baby. Then on to schoolyard and lunchbox, bright face and toothbrush, off to factory feet and process, among others new to the fact that there is no democracy in the way of things. Then on to lover, the fighter, the soldier, true believer, company man, full of strange and tragic oaths towards a world of jealous competition. And in this time, how we shall live, firm now in the knowledge that one day he shall die, and how we shall dream, how we shall strive. Then on to eyes wise with familiarity, as imagination bends with the spine. In these last years, dead man walking, voice trembling, eyes fading, failure coming into view. As time served ends this strange, eventful history, just as it began. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, oaths to oblivion, imprisoned, leaving nothing behind him but measurements to be weighed, documented by doctor's certificate.
Benchy mad, man. Benchy. That's a good one, man. I love it.
The best political poet in America, man. Don't ever forget it.
That's great. Love it. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for following us. As it's happened, we're on Matt Sedillo's Facebook page Mondays at 10 a.m. for about an hour. Matt, would you like to just say a couple things just to close and let folks know that you've got this ongoing series of interviews
Yeah.
that you want to use as a to close with, to address somehow by way of closure.
Okay, yeah. So I got these ongoing things with interviews. I've been interviewing all kinds of people. I got at noon. I'm going to be interviewing Luis Alberto Urrea, author of The Devil's Highway, and Into the Beautiful North, and many other stunning collections of work. That's pretty exciting for me. But I also, and hopefully for the audience, I already interviewed Luis Rodriguez. I have Paul Ortiz was interviewed. I have Margaret Kimberly, author of Prejudicial, was interviewed. A number of people have been interviewed. I think at this point it's been 80 something in the course of a little over a week. And it's kind of interesting. I did this because I gave myself such an intense work schedule of writing poetry, and then like every hour was like almost every hour I was awake was accounted for in work. And it was too intense because, well, sometimes I can be a little bit of an egomaniac. I'm not a narcissist. I need to interact with other people. And so then I was like, all right, well, I'll do these little interviews. We were doing this. And then in order, you only get three of these a month. So I needed to get by one more so we could do it all month. But once I bought it, I was like, oh, no, I need to make use of this. So I'll do a couple of these just to spread out my day so that I'm not just totally focused on my writing and just the content of my own personal mind. And what ended up happening was I happened to me, right? So I happened to myself. And so my compulsive, driven, workaholic nature took over, and I'd start doing 9 a day. So that's where we're at. Wow. So yeah, it's an incredible thing. I'm really looking to get down as many oral histories as possible. So the interviews differ a little bit from this because there's a lot of me talking for the oral histories I'm trying to get. I just try to ask the best questions possible and then get out of the way. I try to ask the question I think that it really helps when I know someone well, but like I try to ask the question I think the person's going to answer best, and with an extended answer, and talk about the things that they're passionate about, and then me just kind of just moving from one section to the next. And allow them to really get out this knowledge base that they and only a few other people will have, or like I interviewed some about Corazon del Pueblo and one of the founders of it, and there's only like 3 or 4 people that know that story in that level of detail, and to get that was great. I've interviewed people about I interviewed a guy the other day who wrote a book about Soul Asylum and also one about Mary J. Blige. Who does that, right? Well, how can I not interview this guy? Right, so that was kind of I interviewed a Marxist-Leninist truck driver. I mean, who like you got to do it. You got to do it. Yeah. When you're presented with the opportunity, you got to do it. So,
all right.
I try to ask these questions. Anyways, so the point of all this is, we got to keep doing. I mean, I don't know. Everyone's talking about like don't tell everyone you have to do this or that, but I have to keep doing things. And I think we need to keep interacting. We need to keep being social. And just because we're locked in doesn't mean we have to be locked out. Remember, you gotta be safe, physical distance, but not social distance.
Yeah. Well, we are orbiting Marx, and this orbit is giving us opportunity to do this stuff. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate the time that you take to entertain us with your presence and your questions. Thank you, each and every one. All right, we're out.